You were always just a glorified music teacher, Isaiah. And it is time we let a real executive run this foundation.
A good program never needed my name on the door.
You were always just a glorified music teacher, Isaiah, and it is time we let a real executive run this foundation. My wife, Simone, did not even look at me when she said it. She kept her eyes fixed on the neat stack of printed agendas in front of her, her manicured finger tapping the polished mahogany of the boardroom table. Sitting right next to her was Trevin Ashworth, our newly appointed donor advisor. Trevin nodded in smooth, synchronized agreement, a subtle smirk playing on the corner of his lips. I sat at the far end of the long conference table at our Germantown headquarters, completely silent. My hands rested flat on my old, scuffed leather briefcase, the same one I had carried since we started the Harmony Seed Foundation 12 years ago. Just 3 months after Simone filed for divorce, the thing I feared most was not losing my marriage. It was losing the living, breathing dream I had poured every ounce of my soul into for over a decade. The foundation was my child, my legacy, and the only hope for hundreds of kids in Nashville who had nothing else. But as I sat in that suffocating room, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the rustle of paper, I realized they weren't just trying to divorce me. They were trying to erase me. An hour earlier, my phone had buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Yara Bell, our program director who had been with us through thick and thin. The text was short and cold. "You need to see this before the meeting this afternoon." At the time, I had no idea that Yara, the quiet, fiercely loyal friend who had stood by the foundation's mission, even when our bank account was empty, was holding the exact piece of evidence that would change everything. I had spent months feeling like I was slipping down a steep, icy slope with no handhold, watching my wife dismantle our life piece by piece. But the truth was about to find its way to me. I had always lived by a very simple rule. A good music program does not need its founder standing in front of the camera. It only needs to stand firm long enough so that the last kid who walks through the door gets to learn how to play an instrument for free. I never wanted the spotlight. I never cared about the gala photos or the local newspaper profiles. I just wanted the music to play. The story of how we got to this silent boardroom began on a crisp, early Tuesday morning in October. I was sitting in my small office at the foundation's headquarters in the Germantown neighborhood of Nashville. It was just after 7 a.m., the quietest hour of the day. Through my window, I could look out at the empty rehearsal rooms, their instruments resting on black stands, waiting for the flood of middle schoolers who would arrive after 3 o'clock. The morning light was pale and thin, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. 12 years of marriage to Simone had started right down the road in Edgehill. We were both young, broke, and full of a naive, beautiful fire. We met as volunteer music tutors at a community center, sitting side by side on an old upright piano that was missing 3 of its upper keys. Simone had a laugh that could fill a room, and I had a head full of classical arrangements and a dream of structured music education for kids who couldn't afford private lessons. In those early years, Simone was my absolute rock. I could still picture her sitting at our kitchen table at 2 in the morning, her eyes bloodshot, writing grant proposals while I drafted curriculum outlines. We used to believe we were building something much bigger than ourselves. We were a team. But 3 months ago, that team officially dissolved. The divorce papers had arrived at my office in a plain, white envelope, delivered by a courier who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Simone hadn't even given me the courtesy of a conversation beforehand. She simply moved out of our home, took our 9-year-old son, Micah, to her mother's estate, and stopped answering my personal calls. Soon after the papers were served, Simone began pulling away from the daily operations of the foundation. She started missing the weekly staff meetings, sessions she once considered sacred. When she did show up, she was accompanied by Trevin Ashworth, a slick, fast-talking consultant her mother, Regina Odom, had recommended. Trevin spoke in the kind of corporate buzzwords that always made my skin crawl. He talked about scaling, monetizing intellectual assets, and streamlining operational redundancies. To him, the kids weren't students finding their voices. They were demographic metrics. Running a nonprofit had taught me a hard lesson that I tried to apply to my own marriage. A sustainable program is never measured by its loudest, most glamorous performance. It is measured by whether it is still standing in its 10th year, long after the applause from the opening night has faded into silence. In our marriage, I had always been the one behind the scenes. I handled the curriculum, managed the instructors, and spent my weekends fixing broken violins and tuning acoustic guitars. I pushed Simone to be the public face of Harmony Seed because I believed she deserved the recognition. She was beautiful, articulate, and excellent at navigating the high society donor circles of Nashville. I wanted her to have the credit. I wanted her to feel valued. I remembered a fundraising gala we hosted 3 years ago. Simone was wearing a stunning green dress, standing under the glittering lights of a downtown hotel ballroom, surrounded by wealthy patrons. During her speech, she had laughed and said, "Sometimes I forget that Isaiah is the one who actually writes the entire curriculum." The crowd had laughed, and I had smiled from my seat near the kitchen doors, happy to let her shine. I didn't realize that her joke was slowly hardening into her actual reality. Step by step, conversation by conversation with her mother and Trevin, she was convincing herself that my silence meant my absence. Now, sitting in the boardroom, the silence between us was deafening. Simone finally looked up from her papers, her expression cold and clinical. "Isaiah," she said, her voice dropping into a tone that was entirely transactional. "We have to look at the reality of our situation. The foundation cannot survive on sentimentality. We need modern leadership, and we need a brand that is ready to expand. This resolution is the best path forward for everyone." Trevin leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table and offering a rehearsed, sympathetic smile. "It's nothing personal, Isaiah. It's just evolution. We appreciate everything you've built, but the founder's stage is over. It's time to let the professionals take it from here." I looked at them both, my heart pounding against my ribs, but I kept my face completely still. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought my usual quiet nature meant I would fold under the pressure to avoid a public scene. But they didn't know what Yara had given me just 30 minutes before. They didn't know that the foundation's survival was built on a secret they had never bothered to uncover. To understand how I ended up sitting in that boardroom, looking at my wife of 12 years as if she were a stranger, we have to go back to exactly 30 minutes before the meeting started. I was sitting in a corner booth at the Red Bicycle coffee shop, just 3 blocks away from our Germantown office. The air inside smelled of roasted espresso and damp autumn coats. Outside, a light Nashville drizzle was starting to smear the windshields of the cars passing down Jefferson Street. I was staring into my black coffee, trying to mentally prepare myself for another round of passive-aggressive debates with Trevin, when the bell above the door chimed. Yara Bell walked in, pulling her damp trench coat tight around her shoulders. Yara had been our program director for 8 years. She was 34, sharp, and possessed a quiet intensity that made people listen whenever she spoke. She didn't order a drink. She walked straight to my booth, slid into the opposite seat, and set a thick, plain manila envelope on the wooden table between us. Her hands were trembling slightly, a detail she tried to hide by folding them in her lap. "Isaiah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was cleaning up the shared donor relations email inbox this morning. Simone asked me to archive some old folders to clear up server space before the board meeting. I don't think she realized what was still sitting in the trash and the drafts." I looked at the envelope. "What is it, Yara?" "It's the blueprint," she said, her eyes locked onto mine with a mixture of anger and deep concern. "They've been planning this for a long time, Isaiah. Long before she served you with those papers." I pulled the documents out of the envelope. The paper was cold to the touch. The very first page was an email thread dated August 14th. exactly 2 months before Simone filed for divorce. The email addresses at the top belonged to Simone and Trevin Ashworth. As I read the words on that page, the coffee in my stomach turned to lead. Trevin had written, "We need to frame this as an operational necessity. If we present it as a strategic merger to the board, Isaiah's curriculum control becomes a liability. We must transition him out of active management first. I've drafted the restructuring proposal. Once he signs the consent waiver, we can finalize the transition." Simone's reply, sent just 3 hours later, read, "Agreed. Regina says the funding is ready, but only if Isaiah is completely removed from the executive seat. She won't let her foundation's name be tied to a program where he still holds veto power. Let's get the waiver ready." I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, right where my ribs met. It wasn't just the betrayal of the divorce, it was the clinical, calculated nature of it. They had been drafting my professional execution while I was still coming home every night, making dinner for our son Micah, and asking Simone how her day was. If you are reading this right now, maybe you know what that feels like. Have you ever looked at someone you shared a bed with for over a decade and realized they had spent months quietly building a cage for you? If you've ever experienced that sudden, freezing realization that your trust was used as a weapon against you, then you know exactly the kind of silence that filled my head at that moment. I flipped to the next document in the stack. It was a formal resolution titled, "Consent to Reorganization and Voluntary Relinquishment of Executive Authority." My eyes scanned the legalese, skipping past the corporate fluff until I reached the bottom of the second page. There, sitting on the signature line above my printed name, was a digital signature, Isaiah Prentiss. The date stamp next to it was September 2nd. "I never signed this," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly distant even to my own ears. "Yara, I've never even seen this document before today. September 2nd was the weekend I took Micah camping in Montgomery Bell State Park. I didn't even have cell service, let alone access to my digital signature portal." "I know," Yara said, her voice tight with anger. "The IP address used to authorize that digital signature matches the desktop computer in Simone's home office. She had your master password, Isaiah. She's had it for years because you trusted her to help with the administrative filings." Relationship therapists often talk about a concept called cognitive restructuring. It's a fancy term for what happens when a manipulator slowly rewrites the history of your relationship. They tell you that you were always distant, that you never cared, that you were the one who let things fall apart. They repeat it so often, so confidently, that you start to doubt your own memory. You start to believe their version of the story, just to keep the peace. For the last 3 months, Simone had been telling me that I was holding the foundation back, that my lack of ambition was suffocating our growth. I had actually started to blame myself, but looking at this forged signature, the fog in my mind instantly cleared. "There's more," Yara said, leaning closer across the table. "Look at the third document." I turned the page. It was a letter on heavy, cream-colored letterhead from the Odom Arts Endowment. The signature at the bottom belonged to Regina Odom, Simone's mother. The letter was addressed directly to Trevin Ashworth. The terms were laid out with terrifying clarity. Regina's endowment was prepared to issue a $2 million grant to the Harmony Seed Foundation, payable over 3 years. However, the disbursement of these funds was strictly contingent upon a complete merger of Harmony Seed into the Odom Arts Network. Under the terms of the merger, the brand Harmony Seed would be dissolved. The entire curriculum, the specialized music theory and teaching methods I had spent 12 years developing and refining for underprivileged youth, would be transferred entirely to Regina's organization. And the final condition? A new executive director, selected by the Odom board, would take full control of the operations. That new director was slated to be Trevin Ashworth. "They aren't just trying to divorce you, Isaiah," Yara said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "They are trying to steal the entire program. They want to package your curriculum, sell it to high-end private schools under Regina's brand, and use the $2 million grant as a tax write-off, while they shut down our free community classes in North Nashville and Edge Hill. I stared at the paper. The curriculum they were planning to sell was designed specifically for kids who couldn't afford a single music lesson. I had spent years writing those books, adapting classical notation into simple, intuitive exercises that a 10-year-old child from a broken home could understand in 30 minutes. It wasn't just a business asset to be traded. It was a lifeline. I carefully folded the documents and placed them back inside the manila envelope. My hands had stopped shaking. A strange, cold calmness had settled over me. "What are you going to do?" Yara asked, her voice filled with a mix of fear and hope. "I'm going to go to the board meeting," I said quietly. "Are you going to confront them?" I looked out the window at the gray Nashville sky. "Not yet. A good musician doesn't start playing the loudest note in the first measure. You have to let them build their arrangement first. You let them think they are in control of the tempo. And then, when they think the song is over, you play the resolution." I stood up, picked up my old leather briefcase, and slid the envelope inside. I looked down at Yara. "Thank you, Yara. You have no idea what you've just done." "Get our foundation back, Isaiah," she said. I walked out of the coffee shop and headed toward the headquarters, the cold rain hitting my face. With every step I took down the cracked sidewalk of Germantown, the weight of the last 12 years seemed to press down on my shoulders. But for the first time in 3 months, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a man who finally had his hands back on the instrument. As I walked back into our headquarters, feeling the cold rain drip from my collar, my mind did not focus on the boardroom or the papers in my briefcase. Instead, my thoughts drifted back to a secret I had kept locked away for exactly 4 years. It was a secret that defined the true cost of the Harmony Seed Foundation, a cost that neither Simone nor our board members had ever had to pay. 4 years ago, the foundation came within days of permanent closure. A major corporate donor, who had pledged $90,000 annually, suddenly filed for bankruptcy. We were left with a massive $60,000 deficit in our operating budget. I had 12 dedicated music instructors who relied on their monthly paychecks to pay their rent and feed their families. If we missed even a single payroll, those teachers would have to leave, our students would be turned away, and other potential donors would see our instability and pull their support immediately. At that exact time, I had just received a $65,000 insurance settlement. It was the payout from a severe car accident that had nearly taken my life a year prior, leaving me with a herniated disc and chronic, burning nerve pain that radiated down my lower back and left leg. That money was explicitly earmarked for a complex spinal fusion surgery and 6 months of specialized physical therapy. It was my ticket to a pain-free life. But when I looked at the empty classrooms and thought about the kids in North Nashville who would lose their only safe haven, I couldn't do it. I quietly made a decision. I deposited the entire settlement into the foundation's general operating account under the designation of an anonymous donor. I paid the teachers' salaries for 3 consecutive months, keeping our doors open and our reputation spotless. I chose absolute silence because I knew that if the public or other donors suspected we were struggling, the foundation would die. I never told Simone, and I never told the board. I chose to live with the physical pain so that our dream could live. For 4 years, I woke up every single morning with a spine that felt like cold iron. I took cheap over-the-counter anti-inflammatories just to stand straight while teaching children how to hold a violin. Simone, completely unaware of the sacrifice, began to complain that I was becoming lazy, lethargic, and lacking the drive to succeed. She didn't realize that my lack of energy was actually the quiet, exhausting work of enduring constant physical agony to protect her security and our shared legacy. And while I was quietly enduring that pain, the snake was already entering our garden. Trevin Ashworth did not just appear out of nowhere. He was introduced to our family almost a year ago at an upscale arts fundraising gala held at the Schermerhorn Symphony Center. The host of the gala was my mother-in-law, Regina Odom, the president of the highly competitive Odom Arts Endowment. Regina had never respected me. To her, a man's worth was measured solely by his zip code, his corporate title, and his ability to command a room of wealthy executives. She viewed my quiet dedication to teaching underprivileged kids as a lack of ambition, an embarrassing hobby rather than a real career. Trevin Ashworth, a slick 43-year-old philanthropy consultant with a perfectly tailored suit and a predatory instinct for vulnerable organizations, knew exactly how to play Regina. At that gala, he cornered her near the private bar and planted a very specific, poisonous seed. "Harmony seed is a goldmine of intellectual property," Trevin had whispered to Regina, swirling his expensive bourbon. But Isaiah's stubborn humility is keeping it small. He treats it like a local after-school club when it should be a regional empire. Under the right, aggressive leadership, you could merge it into the Odom network, scale it, and turn it into a massive brand. But you will never get there as long as Isaiah is running the show. Psychologists and relationship experts often refer to this specific type of manipulation as professional triangulation. It occurs when an outside predatory actor systematically devalues a partner's quiet, consistent contributions by introducing a highly idealized, unrealistic standard of corporate success. The manipulator does not launch a direct attack. Instead, they slowly convince your family that your stability is actually stagnation and that your modesty is a sign of weakness. They make their loud, empty promises look like visionary leadership while making your actual, hard work look invisible. If you have ever had a third party, whether a mother-in-law, a slick colleague, or a toxic friend, quietly whisper in your spouse's ear, making them doubt everything you've built together, then you know exactly how insidious this is. You know the helpless feeling of watching your partner slowly adopt someone else's hostile vocabulary. If you've been through this, you know how hard it is to fight an enemy that operates entirely in the shadows. Trevin used this exact strategy to slowly separate Simone from me. He began offering her private consulting sessions, taking her to expensive business lunches, and showing her beautiful, glossy slide decks of how Harmony Seed could look under his modernized management. He targeted her deepest insecurity, her desire to prove to her powerful mother that she was a successful, independent executive in her own right. He created a false sense of urgency, telling Simone that Regina's $2 million funding grant was a one-time opportunity that would vanish if they didn't act immediately to restructure the foundation and remove the operational bottleneck, which was me. Step by step, conversation by conversation, the professional boundaries between them began to dissolve. They spent weekends together at Regina's estate, ostensibly drafting new strategic plans, while I stayed home in our quiet house, cooking dinner for our 9-year-old son, Micah, and wondering why my wife looked at me with such growing contempt whenever she walked through the door. They had built a complete, alternative reality. In their minds, I was just a glorified music teacher who had gotten lucky. They believed that because I didn't boast, because I didn't demand media attention, and because I didn't care about corporate titles, I would simply roll over and let them take everything. They thought my silence was weakness. Now, standing in the hallway outside the Germantown boardroom, I looked down at the old leather briefcase in my hand. Inside was the envelope Yara had given me, the proof of their forgery, their secret emails, and their plot to dismantle our free community programs to feed their own greed. I reached out, turned the brass doorknob, and walked inside. The game was about to change. I opened the heavy oak door of the boardroom and stepped inside. The temperature in the room felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. Around the long mahogany table sat the 11 members of our board, along with 3 of our largest community donors who had been invited to attend as observers. At the head of the table sat my mother-in-law, Regina Odom, looking like an empress in her tailored gray suit, her sharp eyes tracking my every movement as I walked to my seat at the far end. Simone sat next to her, looking polished but tense, her fingers tightly interlaced. Trevin Ashworth was on her other side, leaning back in his chair with a pen balanced between his fingers, the picture of corporate confidence. "Nice of you to join us, Isaiah," Regina said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We were just about to begin the presentation on the future of the Harmony Seed Foundation." "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Regina," I said quietly, setting my scuffed leather briefcase on the floor beside me. I didn't open it yet. I wanted to let them play their first hand. Simone stood up, clearing her throat to address the room. She was an excellent presenter. She knew how to project energy and make a crowd feel like they were part of something historic. She began speaking about the financial struggles we had faced in the past, the rising costs of maintaining our free programs in North Nashville, and the urgent need for a strategic modernization. She then introduced Trevin, who stood up to walk the board through a series of colorful, high-end slides projecting massive growth and regional expansion. "What we are proposing today," Trevin said, gesturing smoothly to the screen, "is a comprehensive reorganization. To secure the long-term survival of this program, the Odom Arts Endowment has generously offered a $2 million funding grant. However, an infusion of capital this size requires a more robust administrative framework. We are proposing a strategic merger with the Odom Arts Network. Under this new structure, we will streamline our curriculum, optimize our branding, and ensure that our educational models are scaled for maximum impact across the state." One of our oldest board members, Marcus Vance, a retired public school principal who had supported me since day one, raised his hand. "And what does this merger mean for our current leadership and our focus on free community classes in the local neighborhoods?" Trevin smiled, a quick, practiced motion. "Of course, community outreach will remain a core value, but to facilitate this transition, Isaiah Prentiss will step down from active executive duties to assume a highly prestigious, non-operating role as founder emeritus. This will allow our new executive team to focus on the complex regulatory and financial restructuring." "And my veto power over the curriculum?" I asked, speaking up for the first time. My voice was calm, conversational, but it cut straight through the hum of the air conditioner. Simone looked at me, a brief flash of irritation crossing her face. "Isaiah, the curriculum will be managed by a joint academic committee under the Odom Arts umbrella. It's a standard procedure for a merger of this scale. It's about professionalizing the content." "I see," I said, standing up from my chair. "Before the board calls for a vote on this resolution, I have a few supplementary materials that I think are absolutely critical to our decision-making process today. With the board's permission, I'd like to share my screen." Without waiting for Regina or Trevin to object, I walked over to the podium, plugged my laptop into the system, and hit the input toggle. The projector screen flickered, and the colorful slides of Trevin's presentation were instantly replaced by a stark, side-by-side document comparison. On the left side of the screen was the official reorganization proposal that had been emailed to the board members the night before. On the right side was the internal email thread between Simone and Trevin dated August 14th, 2 months before she filed for divorce. A collective murmur ran through the room. I saw Trevin's pen drop onto the mahogany table, with a sharp click. "What you see on the left," I said, my voice steady, "is the narrative of strategic evolution. What you see on the right is the reality. This is an internal email where Mr. Ashworth explicitly states, and I quote, 'We must transition him out of active management first. Once he signs the consent waiver, we can finalize the transition.' My wife, Simone, replied to this, agreeing that her mother's funding was strictly contingent on my complete removal because I held veto power over the curriculum. "Isaiah, this is highly inappropriate," Regina snapped, slamming her hand on the table. "This is a private marital dispute that you are dragging into a professional boardroom." "With all due respect, Regina, this is not a marital dispute," I replied, looking her dead in the eye. "This is an audit of our intellectual property and organizational integrity. If you look at the second slide, you will see why." I pressed a key and a new document appeared on the screen, the consent to reorganization waiver, bearing my digital signature dated September 2nd. Our bylaws require the founder's written consent to any merger that involves the transfer of our proprietary curriculum. This document claims I signed my consent on September 2nd, but on September 2nd, I was off-grid, camping in Montgomery Bell State Park with my son Micah, without a single bar of cellular service. I have also pulled the digital access log for the signing portal, which is displayed right below the signature. The IP address used to authorize this digital signature does not belong to a mobile device in a state park. It belongs to the desktop computer located in Simone's private home office. The room went completely, utterly silent. No one moved. Even the air in the room seemed to have stopped circulating. Marcus Vance leaned forward, his face hardening as he stared at the screen, then turned a long, disappointed look toward Simone. "But the most important part of this presentation is the third slide," I continued, pressing the key once more. "This is the unredacted draft of the Odom Arts merger agreement, recovered from our shared donor relations drafts folder. If you read Section 4, Paragraph B, you will see that upon completion of the merger, the brand Harmony Seed will be legally dissolved. All proprietary teaching methods and curriculum materials will be transferred entirely to Regina Odom's private organization. Furthermore, the clause specifically states that the original founder will have zero authority, input, or control over the utilization or monetization of these materials." I looked at Simone. Her face had gone completely white, her mouth slightly open. She looked at the screen, then turned her head slowly to look at Trevin, and then at her mother. The realization was hitting her like a physical blow. She had believed Trevin's lies that this was just a partnership to help us grow. She hadn't realized that the papers she had helped draft were actually designed to completely strip away and erase the very program she had spent 12 years building by my side. "This was never a merger to save our community classes," I said, looking around the table at the 11 board members. "This was a corporate raid. It was a planned execution designed to take a free, public curriculum, package it for high-end private academies under the Odom brand, and shut down our free programs in North Nashville and Edgehill to use the $2 million grant as a massive tax write-off." I walked back to my seat, picked up my briefcase, and looked at Trevin, who was frantically typing on his phone under the table, his confident smile completely gone. "The presentation is over," I said quietly. "Now, I believe the board has a vote to take." The silence in the boardroom was broken by Marcus Vance, who slowly stood up and adjusted his glasses. He looked directly at Regina and Trevin, his voice steady and heavy with authority. "The motion to merge the Harmony Seed Foundation with the Odom Arts Endowment is officially tabled indefinitely. Furthermore, as a board, we are calling for the immediate termination of Trevin Ashworth's contract as our donor advisor." Regina's face contorted with anger. She didn't say a word. She grabbed her designer leather purse, stood up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor, and marched out of the room. Trevin followed closely behind her, his phone still clutched in his hand, his eyes fixed on the floor as he passed the board members who had once trusted him. Simone didn't follow them. She remained seated, looking at the empty space where her mother and partner had just been. The other board members quietly packed their things and left the room one by one, offering me quiet nods of support. Yara was the last to leave, giving my shoulder a gentle, reassuring squeeze before closing the door behind her. I stayed in the empty room for a long time, listening to the hum of the building as it slowly emptied out. It was past 7 o'clock by the time I finally packed my laptop and walked down the quiet hallway. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the pavement of the Germantown parking lot slick and dark, reflecting the yellow glow of the streetlights. The air was cold and heavy. As I walked toward my old SUV, I saw a figure leaning against the driver's side door. It was Simone. Her coat was open, her hair was slightly damp from the mist, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. "How could you do that to me, Isaiah?" she whispered, her voice cracking as I approached. "In front of the entire board? In front of my mother? You utterly destroyed me in there." "I didn't destroy you, Simone. I said, stopping a few feet away from her. I showed them the truth. You and Trevin were the ones who tried to destroy the foundation. You tried to sign away my curriculum with a forged signature. I didn't know about the brand dissolution, she yelled, her voice echoing in the empty parking lot. Trevin told me the merger was the only way to save us. He told me that you were holding us back, that your lack of ambition was going to kill the foundation. I was just trying to protect what we built. By forging my signature? I asked, my voice deadly quiet. By signing a document that would take our free classes away from the kids in North Nashville and Edge Hill? Simone took a step back, her chest heaving. You don't understand what it was like for me, Isaiah. For 12 years, I've been the face of this foundation. I went to the galas, I shook the hands, I begged the donors for money. But every time we got a win, everyone knew it was because of your curriculum. I was always just standing in your shadow. You sat in your quiet little office, playing the humble founder, while I had to carry the burden of making sure we had enough money to keep the lights on. I wanted to prove to my mother and to myself that I could lead this place into something bigger. Trevin was the only one who actually saw me. He was the only one who told me I deserved to be more than just your spokesperson. I looked at her, and for the first time in months, the anger in my chest was replaced by a profound, heavy sadness. You thought you were in my shadow, Simone? I asked, taking a step closer to her. I never wanted a shadow. I built that curriculum and put your name on the foundation's masthead because I wanted you to shine. I hated the cameras, yes, but I pushed you into the spotlight because I believed you deserved to be there. I wanted the world to see how incredible you were, but you let Trevin rewrite our entire history. She wiped a tear from her cheek, her defensive anger starting to crack. You don't know what it's like to carry the financial stress of this place alone, Isaiah. You didn't have to worry when the corporate donors pulled out. You just kept teaching your classes while I was drowning in anxiety. I didn't worry? I let out a dry, bitter laugh. Simone, you have no idea what I did to keep this place alive. I reached down and touched my lower back, where the familiar burning pain was currently radiating down my left leg. 4 years ago, when our major corporate donor went bankrupt and we had a $60,000 deficit, you thought an anonymous donor saved us. Do you remember that? Simone nodded slowly, her brow furrowing in confusion. Yes, we got a $65,000 anonymous deposit that saved our payroll. That wasn't an anonymous donor, Simone. That was my car accident insurance settlement. She froze, her eyes widening. What? That money was supposed to pay for my spinal fusion surgery and my physical therapy. It was my only chance to live a normal life without chronic, agonizing pain. But our teachers were about to lose their jobs, and our students were about to be locked out of their classrooms. If the public found out we were bankrupt, the foundation would have folded right then. So I quietly deposited that money into our account as an anonymous donation to protect our reputation and your pride. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my throat. I never told you because I didn't want you to feel the guilt of knowing my health paid for our survival. For 4 years, I have woken up every single morning with a spine that feels like it's being crushed by a vice. I have stood on my feet for 8 hours a day teaching kids, taking cheap pills just to keep from collapsing from the pain. And while I was quietly enduring that agony, to keep our dream alive, you were sitting in expensive restaurants with Trevin, talking about how lazy and lethargic I had become. You let him convince you that my quietness was weakness. Simone stared at me, her face completely pale under the parking lot lights. She looked down at my back, then back up at my face, her eyes filled with a sudden, horrifying realization. The narrative that Trevin had built for her, the story of a lazy, unambitious husband who was dragging her down, was completely shattering. Isaiah, she whispered, her voice trembling violently. I didn't know. Oh my God, I didn't know. Of course you didn't, I said, my voice dropping back to its quiet, exhausted tone. Because you stopped looking at me a long time ago, Simone. You only looked at the version of me that Trevin and your mother wanted you to see. She covered her mouth with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she broke down into deep, chest-heaving sobs. The rain began to fall again, a soft drizzle that mixed with the tears running down her face in that empty, dark parking lot. The illusion of her corporate victory had completely vanished, leaving her with nothing but the devastating weight of the truth. The morning after our confrontation in the rainy parking lot, I did not feel the triumph I had expected. The board had rejected the merger, and Trevin's consulting contract was terminated, but the wreckage of a 12-year marriage and a compromised foundation still lay scattered all around me. I was sitting at my desk, rubbing my temple where a dull, persistent headache was starting to form, when my desk phone rang. It was our primary account manager at Pinnacle Financial Partners. Isaiah! The manager's voice sounded tight, professional but deeply concerned. I'm calling because we've flagged some unusual activity on the Harmony Seed Foundation's primary operating accounts. As of 9 o'clock this morning, a temporary administrative hold has been placed on all outgoing wire transfers and payroll disbursements. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. A hold? On what grounds? I am the primary executive signatory on those accounts. We received a formal dispute filed late yesterday evening by an authorized representative of your board, accompanied by a signed power of attorney, the manager explained. The document authorizes Trevin Ashworth of Ashworth Philanthropic Advisors to act on behalf of the co-founder, Simone Prentiss, to freeze the assets pending a forensic audit due to suspected operational irregularities. Until our legal department reviews the validity of the dispute, we cannot release the funds. I sat frozen, the receiver pressed hard against my ear. The monthly payroll for our 12 instructors was scheduled to draft in exactly 48 hours. If those accounts remained frozen, the checks would bounce, the teachers would not be paid, and the fragile trust we had built with our community partners over the last 12 years would vanish in an instant. Trevin Ashworth was not going down quietly. He knew he had lost the board, but he was using the final weapon Simone had handed him before her eyes were opened. He was trying to burn the house down on his way out. This is what behavioral psychologists call the scorched earth phase of a manipulative personality. When a professional manipulator or a toxic partner realizes that their mask has been completely ripped off, they rarely slip away quietly. Instead, they shift all their energy into maximizing damage. If they cannot control the asset, they will attempt to destroy it so that no one else can have it either. They will use every legal loophole, every signed authorization, and every piece of shared custody or property to inflict as much pain as possible, leaving you to clean up the ashes. If you have ever had to deal with someone who would rather destroy their own family's financial security just to win a petty legal battle, then you know the sheer panic that set in when I heard those words from the bank manager. Go ahead and nod your head if you've ever had to face an enemy who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I hung up the phone and immediately called Simone. She answered on the second ring, her voice quiet, hoarse, and completely drained of the anger she had carried the night before. Isaiah? She whispered. Simone? Did you sign a power of attorney over our bank accounts to Trevin? I asked, keeping my voice as calm as possible, though the tension was eating me alive. There was a long, horrified silence on the other end of the line. I signed a general administrative authorization 2 weeks ago. He told me it was necessary so he could prepare the financial transition documents for the Odom grant. He said it was just a standard formality, so he could pull the bank statements directly. Isaiah, what did he do? He used it to freeze our entire operating account, I said. Our payroll drafts in 48 hours. If those funds aren't released, our teachers won't get paid, and the foundation is going to hit a wall. He's trying to suffocate us, Simone. I heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of her quiet, sobbing. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't think he would go this far." "Apologies aren't going to pay our teachers, Simone," I said, my voice firm. "We need to fix this. Right now. I need you to meet me at the main branch of Pinnacle Financial on West End Avenue in 30 minutes. You need to sign a formal, notarized revocation of that power of attorney in front of the bank's legal counsel. Are you going to help me save this place, or are you going to let him finish what he started?" "I'll be there," she said instantly. "I'm leaving right now." When I arrived at the bank, Simone was already waiting in the lobby. She looked completely different from the polished, untouchable executive who had sat next to her mother in our boardroom 24 hours earlier. She was wearing an oversized sweater, her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wasn't wearing any makeup. She looked like the girl I had met 12 years ago in Edgehill, the one who used to stay up with me eating cold pizza while we write music curriculum. We spent the next 3 hours locked in a small, glass-walled conference room with the bank's regional director and 2 corporate lawyers. Simone did not hesitate. She took full responsibility, explaining to the lawyers that she had been misled, and signed every revocation document they placed in front of her. She even provided the lawyers with her personal login details and communication logs with Trevin to prove that he had exceeded the scope of the authorization she had originally intended to give him. As the lawyers stepped out to finalize the release of our accounts, Simone sat across the table from me, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of water. "My mother is furious with me," she said quietly, staring down at the table. "She called me this morning and told me that if I didn't proceed with the divorce under her terms, she would cut me off from the Odom family trust entirely. She said I was ruining our family name by siding with you." "And what did you say to her?" I asked. Simone looked up, her eyes clear despite the tears. "I told her that you were the only one who ever actually sacrificed anything for me. I told her about the car accident settlement, Isaiah. I told her that while she was busy buying expensive art and judging you, for your scuffed shoes, you were quietly living in physical agony just to make sure I had a home and a foundation to run. She didn't have an answer for that. She just hung up on me." She set her water cup down and reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of mine, as if she didn't have the right to touch me anymore. "I've spent the last 3 months believing that I was the strong one, the one who was saving the foundation from your stagnation. But the truth is, I was just a pawn for people who wanted to steal your hard work. I am so sorry, Isaiah. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I know our marriage is over, but I won't let them take Harmony Seed from you. I won't." For the first time in 3 months, the tight, burning knot in my lower back seemed to ease just a fraction. The accounts were going to be unlocked, and the payroll would clear. We had survived the scorched earth attack, but as I looked at my wife, I knew that while the foundation was saved, the life we had built together could never go back to the way it was. We had survived the collapse, but the road to rebuilding our separate futures was just beginning. The weeks that followed the bank account crisis felt like the slow clearing of a massive, destructive storm. Once the bank's legal team verified the revocation of the power of attorney, our operating funds were fully restored, and the instructor's payroll cleared without a single hour of delay. But we didn't stop there. With Yara's help and the backing of our board members, we launched a comprehensive internal audit of all consultant contracts and financial transactions handled during Trevin Ashworth's tenure at the Harmony Seed Foundation. What we discovered was a trail of systemic manipulation that went far deeper than a single forged signature. As we dug into the digital archives, we uncovered that Trevin had been charging the foundation exorbitant consulting fees that had never been fully authorized by the board. He had structured these payments in small, monthly increments to keep them just below the threshold that required a formal board vote. But the real blow to Trevin's career came from an unexpected direction. One of our major community donors, who also served on the board of a prominent youth development nonprofit in Memphis, caught wind of the controversy surrounding our tabled merger. He reached out to Marcus Vance with a warning. 2 years prior, Trevin had operated under a different firm name in Memphis. He had used the exact same playbook there, identifying a highly successful, founder-led nonprofit, building a close relationship with an insecure board member, sowing seeds of division within the leadership, and attempting to force a strategic merger with a larger corporate network that he controlled. In the Memphis case, he had successfully managed to dissolve the original organization, packaging its educational assets and selling them to a private charter network for a massive personal commission. When Marcus Vance presented these findings to our board, the decision was unanimous. We did not just terminate Trevin's contract, we forwarded our complete audit report, along with the digital access logs of my forged signature, to the Tennessee Nonprofit Regulatory Division and the District Attorney's Office. Faced with the threat of criminal wire fraud charges and the permanent destruction of his reputation in the philanthropic sector, Trevin did what all predators do when they are finally cornered by the light. He packed his bags, resigned from all his advisory positions across the state, and quietly slipped out of the Nashville nonprofit community, leaving no forwarding address. With Trevin gone, Regina Odom's grand plan to absorb our foundation completely collapsed. Without her slick frontman to run the operation and manage the narrative, she was left exposed. A month after the boardroom confrontation, Regina requested a private meeting with me. She didn't ask to meet at her lavish office or at an upscale downtown restaurant. Instead, she came to our quiet headquarters in Germantown. She sat in the small wooden chair in my office, looking noticeably older, the sharp, untouchable armor she usually wore showing visible cracks. "I am not here to apologize, Isaiah," Regina said, her voice lacking its usual cold authority, replaced instead by a tired, flat tone. "But I owe you an explanation. When Simone was growing up, I watched her father, my late husband, slowly lose himself to a larger corporate entity. He spent his entire life working behind the scenes, building something beautiful, only to have his name completely erased from the history books when he passed away. I swore to myself that I would never let my daughter live under someone else's shadow. I wanted her to be the leader, the face, the one who held the power." She paused, looking out the window at the empty courtyard where a group of young students was arriving for their afternoon lessons. "When Trevin came to me with his proposal, I saw what I wanted to see. I let my own fear for my daughter's legacy blind me to what he actually was. I ignored the warning signs because I wanted so badly for Simone to be the sole champion of this foundation. I was wrong. I didn't realize that in trying to pull her out of what I thought was your shadow, I was letting a thief steal the very ground you both stood on." "Simone was never in my shadow, Regina," I said quietly. "She was my partner. If she felt invisible, it was because we stopped talking to each other, not because I was trying to block her light." Regina nodded slowly, a small, sad gesture. "She told me what you did 4 years ago, with your insurance money. Isaiah, a man who sacrifices his own physical health to protect his wife's peace of mind, is not a man who casts a shadow. He is a man who builds a foundation. I won't interfere with your organization anymore. The Odom Arts Endowment will continue to support your community programs, but we will do so as silent donors, with 0 strings attached." She stood up, extended her hand to me, a gesture she had never offered in the 12 years I had known her, and left my office. But the most significant change occurred in the divorce proceedings. A week after our meeting at the bank, Simone instructed her high-priced divorce attorneys to completely withdraw their original filing. She fired the aggressive legal team her mother had paid for and hired a mediator specializing in collaborative family law. The new agreement she proposed was entirely different. There were no demands for the foundation's assets, no attempts to claim intellectual property rights to my curriculum, and no fight for sole custody of our son Micah. Simone voluntarily relinquished any claim to the foundation's operating accounts and signed a binding legal release ensuring that the Harmony Seed brand and all curriculum materials would remain permanently under my executive control. "I don't want to fight you, Isaiah," she told me during our final mediation session in downtown Nashville. "I want us to be parents to Micah and I want you to run the foundation the way it was meant to be run. You built this dream with your own hands and your own pain. I have no right to take that from you." We signed the final decree on a quiet Thursday afternoon in November. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic courtroom scenes, and no bitter recriminations. We walked out of the courthouse together, the autumn leaves blowing across the stone steps of the public square. We were no longer husband and wife, but we were no longer enemies. We had managed to salvage our respect for one another from the wreckage of a storm that had nearly destroyed us both. 6 months had passed since that cold autumn evening when Simone and I signed our final divorce papers on the steps of the Nashville public square. It was now late May, and the humid southern air was filled with the sweet, heavy scent of blooming honeysuckle. The auditorium at our Germantown headquarters was packed to capacity with families, neighborhood leaders, and board members. Black music stands lined the stage, and the soft, chaotic sounds of children tuning their violins, cellos, and flutes filled the warm room. This was our annual spring showcase, the crown jewel of the Harmony Seed Foundation. But this year, the atmosphere felt entirely different. It felt lighter, cleaner, as if a dark, suffocating fog had finally been cleared away. I stood in the wings of the stage, my hand resting flat against the wooden doorframe to ease the pressure on my lower back. The chronic nerve pain was still there, a constant, quiet reminder of the massive sacrifice I had made 4 years ago to keep this organization alive, but it no longer felt like a crushing weight. With the legal battle behind us and our finances fully stabilized under the board's new oversight, I had finally scheduled a consultation with a spinal specialist for later this summer. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to a life that wasn't defined by constant, agonizing pain. As I looked out at the stage, my eyes found my 9-year-old son, Micah. He was sitting in the first chair of the violin section, wearing a slightly oversized white button-down shirt and a crooked black bow tie. He was carefully checking the tuning of his A string, his brow furrowed in deep, quiet concentration. He had my eyes, but he possessed his mother's intense, focused determination. I looked past the stage and into the crowded auditorium. Sitting in the middle of the third row was Simone. She looked beautiful, dressed in a simple navy blue dress, her hair falling softly around her shoulders. She wasn't surrounded by her mother's high society friends, nor was she sitting with any corporate consultants or aggressive lawyers. She was sitting completely alone, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed entirely on Micah. As if sensing my gaze, she slowly turned her head and looked toward the wings of the stage. Our eyes met across the crowded, noisy room. There was no anger left in her expression, no defensiveness, and no lingering resentment. There was only a quiet, deep, and mutual respect. She offered me a small, gentle nod, and I returned it with a genuine smile. Regina Odom was not in the audience tonight. True to her word, she had stepped back completely from our daily operations, and the Odom Arts Endowment had transitioned into a silent, hands-off benefactor, routing their funding directly through our community board, with 0 operational strings attached. It was a massive win for the local schools, but an even bigger win for Simone, who had finally broken free from her mother's suffocating expectations. Simone had started a small, independent consulting firm of her own, helping local, grassroots nonprofits secure small-scale grants without the interference of corporate raiders. She was finally building her own path, out of anyone's shadow, and doing it with absolute integrity. Yara Bell stepped up to the microphone, her face beaming as she welcomed the parents and introduced the first performance of the evening. The audience erupted into warm applause. Micah stood up from his chair and walked to the center of the stage. He raised his violin, resting it gently against his shoulder, and lifted his bow. The auditorium fell into a profound, expectant silence. He began to play a simple, beautiful arrangement of Bach's Minuet in G, the very piece I had taught him on my old acoustic violin in our living room years ago. His fingers moved with a smooth, natural grace, the notes ringing out clear and true, filling every corner of the room. As I watched him play, I realized that the music we teach these kids is never just about the notes on the page. It's about teaching them how to find harmony in the midst of chaos. Betrayal, pain, and deceit will always try to disrupt the melody of our lives. But if you have a solid foundation, you can survive any storm. You can let the loudest, most discordant notes play themselves out, and then you can play the resolution. I watched Simone wipe a single, proud tear from her cheek as Micah finished his solo. The audience erupted into a standing ovation. Simone stood up, clapping enthusiastically, her eyes shining. I stepped out of the wings and into the light, joining the applause. We stood on opposite sides of the room, both clapping for our son, completely unified in our love for him, even though our paths had permanently diverged. This long, painful journey has taught me a hard, essential truth that I will carry with me for the rest of my days. A man's humility is not an empty space for others to write their names on. For years, I believed that my silence was a form of strength, that enduring physical and emotional pain in absolute isolation was the ultimate proof of my love and dedication. I thought that by hiding my sacrifices, I was protecting those around me. But the truth is, my silence was a wall. It prevented the people I loved from truly seeing me, and it created a vacuum that allowed predatory manipulators like Trevin to write their own toxic narrative about who I was. Your modesty only becomes a trap when you never let your partner or your family know exactly what you are carrying. Love does not demand that you suffer in silence. It demands that you invite the people you care about into your reality, burdens and all. So if you are reading this story tonight, I want you to stop and take a long, honest look at your own life and your own relationship. Do not wait for a crisis to force the truth into the light. Do not wait for a forged signature, a pile of divorce papers, or a corporate betrayal to break the silence. If you are carrying an invisible weight to keep your family afloat, whether it is a physical pain, a financial burden, or a quiet sacrifice that no one else knows about, speak up tonight. Share it with your truth. Let your partner see the raw, unvarnished cost of the life you are building together. And if you are the partner who has been standing in the spotlight, take a moment to look closely at the person in the background. Look past the quiet exterior. Look past the scuffed shoes and ask them what they are carrying. Communication is not just about talking. It is about ensuring that the quietest voice in the room is still being heard. Tonight, before you close your eyes, have that difficult, necessary conversation. Save your